Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Kilayim, Chapter 8, Halacha 1. This is part 2 of the shir in the Art Scroll. We're on 69a1. Today we're getting into the penalties of plowing with Kilayim, but the brilliancy here is the course of the conversation is going to be dealing with doing it in the Sheviis year, in the 7th year. Now, I want you to appreciate the brilliancy of Chazal because they're taking what is one of the hardest concepts in all of Zerayim, which is what do we do with plowing in Sheviis? And now we're trying to look at plowing in terms of Kilayim to understand liability. I want you to understand the brilliance of what's going on here because they purposefully went and they picked something that's a very controversial issue, and now that's the crux of what we are dealing with to try to understand the penalties and also what do you do with plowing and Kilayim. Now, this very much is connected with part 1 of this year because, as you remember, Rabbi Akiva is coming along and agreeing with the Tanna Kama, the sages, and saying that you're not allowed to maintain Kilayim. But the difference in agreement is going to be whether you get lashes for it or not. And Rabbi Akiva says that you do get lashes, and the rabbis are saying that you don't get lashes. And the idea is, what happens if you're going to be going ahead and covering this seed with earth? Are you guilty now of maintaining Kilayim? That's what one opinion is. That's effectively Rabbi Akiva's position. Or did you go ahead and you actually sowed? You actually covered this and now you were sowing. And that's what they're using in part 1 of this shir to look at what's the liability going to be. Now we're getting back to covering the seeds, but in terms of plowing. Now I want to look at Sheviis because, again, they are zeroing in on one of the hardest to understand oral laws in all of Zerayim, and that's what they're picking up. And if you're not really clear on the arguments, you kind of miss it. It kind of just becomes a mush in your head. Now, the Torah itself in Vayikra 25, and it's going to be the first few verses there, reads like this. It says, Hashem spoke to Moses on Mount Sinai, saying, speak to the children of Israel and say to them, when you come into the land that I am giving you, the land shall observe a Shabbos rest to Hashem. And it says, 6 years you may sow your field, 6 years you may prune your vineyard. You catch that? It says sow and prune. Very good. And it continues, and it says, and you may gather the produce. Okay, so we have gathering in there. So we're seeing these like list of forbidden things. It says, but in the 7th year, there shall be a complete rest for the land. Okay, that means a complete rest. You're not supposed to do anything. Fine. A Shabbos to Hashem. Very good. Your field you shall not sow. Your vineyard you shall not prune. Okay, now those are negative commandments. And that's going to be the point that Rabbi Yochanan is going to be making, right? You catch that? It says, 6 years you may sow, right? And it says all the things that you may do during the 6th year. But now you have 2 being talked about in the 7th year as lo ta'aseh, negative commandments. What are those negative commandments? It's going to be that you shall not sow, and your vineyard you shall not prune. Now it continues. It says the aftergrowth of your harvest you shall not reap, and the grapes you set aside for yourself you shall not pick, and it shall be a year of rest for the land. It continues, it says, the uncultivated produce of the land shall be for you to eat, for you, your slave, your maidservant, your laborer, your resident who dwells with you, and for your animal and the beast that is in your land, and all the produce to eat. Now, what is missing out of here? Plowing. Plowing is not in that list. Now, there's other things in there. You have pruning, you have reaping, you have picking, you have gathering, you have sowing, but plowing is not there. And one of the ideas is that when you're looking at what is the status of plowing, we see that in Masechet Sheviis chapter 1, and this is a back and forth between the Tanaim. This is, in fact, going to be a back and forth between Rabbi Akiva himself and also with Rabbi Yishmael. Rabbi Yishmael is going to be saying that Sheviis is going to be having plowing as a forbidden work effort, and that's going to be d'oraita, that you're not allowed to do it, and even many Rishonim are going to be saying that, according to Rabbi Yishmael, plowing is forbidden biblically. But Rabbi Yishmael is proving that as a halacha Moshe Sinai. And this comes up in Rosh Hashanah, I believe it's page 2 in the Bavli, and because it's saying, well, what can you do 30 days before Rosh Hashanah, right? And Rabbi Yishmael is coming to derive this as halacha Moshe Sinai. Rabbi Akiva is saying that, look, Vayikra in chapter 25 does not mention plowing there at all. And in fact, you have to go look at in Shemot 34:21, where it says, from plowing and reaping shall you desist. And he's saying, Rabbi Akiva is saying that this is talking about plowing in the 7th year. But Rabbi Yishmael doesn't say that. He doesn't say that this verse is even talking about Sheviis at all. And so they're both going to agree that you can't do plowing in terms of being a d'oraita. But Rabbi Akiva is proving it from Shemot 34:21, which says that from plowing and reaping you shall desist. But again, Rabbi Yishmael counters and says, well, that verse isn't anything about Shabbat at all. And he's saying that that's just talking about plowing on the Shabbos day. It has nothing to do with plowing on the 7th year. Now, Rabbi Akiva would come back and say, well, wait a second. Shabbos here and Shabbos there is a Gezer Shava that we can learn that just as, you can't plow over here on Shabbos in the day, you also can't do it in the year. And Rabbi Yishmael comes back and says that actually we don't learn it that way. We learn it as an oral law. That's a halacha Moshe Sinai. And there's a back and forth here, because even like the Rambam, his position in Hilchos Shmita, the Yovel 1:1 or 1:10 is even going to be vague. And like people like the Ravads are going to be saying that part of the vagueness of that is that there's different purposes of plowing. You have plowing as a process of planting seeds, but also to nourish trees to grow. Why? To get the water into the ground. And so the idea is that it's the sowing with the plowing that's a sowing that's going to be biblically prohibited. But the Ravaz explains the Rambam as saying that plowing to improve the land is going to be d'Rabbanan during Sheviis. Now, that's going to be the question that comes up here. So when you have the plowing now to cover these seeds, well, what did you do, right? Is plowing going to be something that's a forbidden thing, even with regards to Kilayim? And that's really what we're getting at. So I want you to appreciate the cleverness of Hazal to go into what is, I think, one of the most hard to understand malokits between the Tanaim. And because again, is this really going to be like a Gezer Shava, like what Rabbi Akiva is saying, or is this just a halacha Moshe Sinai? And, are there parts of plowing that are going to be d'oraita? Are there parts of plowing that's going to be d'Rabbanan? And this is also going to be a malokit among the Rishonim, not just the Tanaim. Now, this is going to get into the malokit on plowing with the Amorim, and what do you do with this? So the Gemara is going to start off, and it's going to talk about seeds of trees. Now, seeds of trees are not subject to the prohibition of Kilayim, but we see that there is one kind of tree that is. What is that? Well, that's the vineyard. That's Kalei HaKerem. So the Vilna Goan is going to explain the Gemara that comes up right now before we get into this thing of plowing with what do we do with seeds of trees as being connected with the last conversation. Now, the last conversation in part 1 was talking about the prohibition of Kilayim, and that's being, with the source in the Torah in the vineyard. And there's an extra word, Kilayim, where it's talking about in your vineyard. And the Gemara that's going to be coming up right now is going to make a point that that what we're dealing with here is going to be for grape seeds and not for other kinds of seeds, and that the other kinds of seeds are not connected with the laws of Kilayim. So the Gemara starts and says, Rabbi Yudan of Cappadocia posed a question to Rabbi Yossi, and it says there, you say regarding Kilayim, that the seeds of trees are not considered seeds, and therefore you can plant in a vineyard or alongside grain or vegetables. In other words, that only the prohibition is going to come up for vines, for grapevines. It's not going to be dealing with seeds of trees like with grains or vegetables or whatever. And we know this actually from the Yerushalmi and Peah in chapter 1, Halacha 4. So over there, it's going to be saying that tree seeds are not included in the prohibitions of Kalei Zerayim or even Kalei Akarim, and that this prohibition on the seeds for a tree in this one case is only for the grapevine. So if you have like hazelnut trees and you have the hazelnuts and you want to plant some hazelnuts and right next to it plant some cabbage, we don't have these setback issues. But certainly if you have grapevine seeds for grapevines, for grapes, and now you plant them next to cabbage, certainly you have a problem. That's what we've been dealing with for the last 8 chapters. But if you have grapevines and you have hazelnut seeds and you plant them next to each other, you don't have a problem. So the idea is that, we see that Zerayim, where it's talking about seed, is going to be talking about something like a grain or a legume. And tree seeds are not normally referred to as a type of Zerayim, and so they're not in this prohibition. In other words, what is the common phraseology when we're talking about you shall not sow? This, by the way, comes up in Vayikra 19:19. It's the Torah itself is using the word Zerayim or Zeriah, right? And that's talking about like sowing Zerayim, which are going to be seeds. What are you sowing? Well, you're sowing barley, you're sowing wheat, you're sowing lentils, things like that. That's what we think about. That's what we're calling Zerayim. Well, what about hazelnuts, right? Or you're going to grow some hazelnut trees. Well, you're not sowing that in a normal type of way, and people don't even refer to those as a normal kind of seed. It's trying to make that distinction. So again, what they're saying here is Rabbi Yudan of Cappadocia is posing this question to Rabbi Yossi. He's saying there, you say regarding Kilayim that seeds of trees are not considered seeds, and here you're saying with regard to Tuma susceptibility that tree seeds are considered seeds. So in other words, that you can make them susceptible through hechsher to Tuma. So we know that in Makshirin, it talks about that you make something wet with one of the 7 liquids, and now this gets hechsher. Hechsher means that it's been prepared, that it can now receive Tuma. So what's going to be the difference between these kinds of seeds that we're talking about for Kilayim, things that you sow, like, where you're throwing your hand and you're sowing them, like lentil seeds, like barley seeds and wheat seeds, and now we're talking about here tree seeds that you can actually get susceptibility to Tuma. What's going to be the difference? And Rabbi Yossi is going to explain what looks like a contradiction, but it's not. Rabbi Yossi says back to Rabbi Yudan that there, with regard to Kilayim, the Torah excluded anything that people do not commonly refer to as seeds. However, here, with regard to Tuma susceptibility, the Torah includes anything that is a seed because of the way the Torah is expressing this with an extra verse. So if you look in Vayikra 11:37, this is the quote that the Gemara says, and says, and if its carcass will fall upon any seed of a seed plant that is sown. You catch what's saying here? See here, upon any seed. Now, we're talking about 2 different kinds of seeds, right? One that we see in Kilayim that you are normally sowing, like, throwing a handful of barley onto the ground. And then you see another kind of seed. What's that going to be? Well, like your hazelnuts or seeds that are not normally referred to as seeds, and these are going to be trees, things that are going to be planted certainly in a different way than, your lentils or barley or wheat. And, you certainly don't sow your hazelnuts to produce a grove of trees anywhere near in the same way that you're going to be producing a field of grain. It's not done the same way. And in fact, the seeds themselves are going to be looking different, going to be acting different. One of the other things about that is that the seeds for trees generally have a hard shell around them, and that's going to be, or it's going to have a fruit around it, and it's going to be where it can stay in the ground for, say, more than 3 days. And we know that the wheat seed, once it starts to germinate, and if it fails to actually come through, will start to rot. There's going to be a difference between, say, like the wheat, which is surrounded by a husk, but the husk is like a type of like chitin. Very like, it's a different kind of quality than what you're going to find on something that's surrounding a seed for a tree, like a peach pit, right? Or an almond seed, or the hazelnut, or chestnut, which is going to be surrounded by a hard shell. That, what you're going to be seeing for like a lentil, or what you're going to see for a bean, or you're going to see for, barley, which has like a husk that can be used to firm up bread, to add to bread, things like that, really is not at all similar in the protectiveness or quality of what you're going to see in the type of thing like for a tree. So again, what Rabbi Yossi is coming to explain is that the verse here has this extra term here. It says upon any seed, and then also says of a seed plant that is sown. And in other words, what it's saying is that it's connecting these two things with the extra verse, seed and seed, to show that it's going to be for a regular kind of seed that you're normally used to sowing, like wheat, barley, and then also the other kind, which is a seed, right? A tree, before you plant it, comes from a seed. So it's also going to be from that. So the Gemara now gets into the main topic about what are we doing with plowing and what are we doing with lashes and punishment. So the Gemara is looking back now at this conversation that came up in part 1 of this year in chapter 8, Halacha 1. That's back and forth between Rabbi Akiva and the rabbis about what happens when you're covering the seeds with earth and you're plowing, or you're just covering it over. Are you sowing, or are you guilty of maintaining Kilayim? Now, Rabbi Akiva and the rabbis agree you're not allowed to maintain Kilayim, but what they disagree about is going to be the punishment, and that's really what we're getting into here. Now, this Gemara starts off and says, Rabbi Yochanan says in the name of Rabbi Yanai, that, by the way, is going to be his teacher, that says that one who covers seeds of Kilayim with earth is subject to lashes for transgressing the prohibition to sow Kilayim. In other words, the act of covering the seeds with earth is tantamount to sowing. Now, Rabbi Akiva's position is a little different. His is going to be that what did you do by covering with the earth? You were maintaining it. You weren't sowing it. You were maintaining it. So if you have two seeds of two different species lying next to each other on the ground, and now you're covering it with earth, effectively what this is saying is that Rabbi Yanai is saying that you're subject to lashes. Now, why are you subject to lashes? Well, he's going to be saying that you are sowing Kilayim. And in Rabbi Yanai's idea of this, the prohibition against sowing Kilayim is not limited to the act of placing the seeds in the ground, but also, by the way, covering them. And that is also going to be part of it. And again, this is going to be getting into what are we dealing with in terms of sowing, because this very much looks like an act of sowing, right? Rabbi Yanai's case, says a Chazan Ish, is talk about where there's mingled seeds that would have taken root and sprouted even without being covered by earth. So it would be obvious that, covering them is going to constitute sowing. In other words, Rabbi Yanai's point, according to the Chazan Ish, in his Kilayim 2.8 commentary, is going to be that this would have taken root anyway. It would have sprouted anyway, even if you didn't cover it. But what did you do by covering it? You were sowing it. And that's going to be something that's a little bit different. In other words, by having them on the earth, maybe that looks a lot like what Rabbi Akiva is saying. He's saying that you've maintained it. Well, the Chazan Ish is pointing out that Rabbi Yanai's case is that you've now covered it. That looks a lot like plowing. And by the way, what happened when you did that? You were sowing. Rabbi Akiva's case is a little different. He's going to be saying that, no, you were maintaining it, that that you actually maintained it. But again, halacha is not going to be by Rabbi Akiva in this case. So the Gemara is going to look at Rabbi Yochanan's comment regarding this ruling by his teacher. So Rabbi Yochanan says in this Gemara to Rabbi Yanai, it says that this is not taught in a Mishnah in Tractate Makot. It says, is this not taught in a tractate in Makot regarding one who is liable for transgressing 8 prohibitions for planting a single furrow? Now I want to recap what that Mishnah in Makot is saying. This, by the way, is in 3.8. And basically it's saying that, okay, what's going to be the penalty if somebody takes a furrow and he's going and he's planting? How many liabilities can you count up to? So what is one of them? Well, hey, look, you could be planting Kilayim. So that would be a violation there. You made a furrow and you planted within the, say, 4 amos of a grapevine. So, okay, we know that that's a Kilayim prohibition. What else can you get out of that, right? Well, you could also be doing that in the Sheviis year. And that comes back to the cleverness of what's going to be going on over here. Then what else could you be getting? Well, maybe that was done by a Nazir. And a Nazir is doing it in an area where the ground is tameh. So now he's walking and doing things in an area that's tameh, like a graveyard. That would be a third violation. And what if you're doing that on Yom Tov? Well, you're not allowed to make furrows and do things like that on Yom Tov. And the list continues over there. So what are we dealing with over here? We're dealing with a connection in this Mishnah between Sheviis and Kilayim. So Rabbi Yochanan says back to his teacher, Rabbi Yanai, says, is it not taught in the Mishnah and Tractate Makot regarding somebody who's liable for transgressing 8 prohibitions by plowing a single furrow? And the Mishnah lists the following transgression as one of the 8, Kilayim in a vineyard. And it says, how is it possible to transgress a law of Kilayim through plowing? And is it not where one covered the Kilayim seeds with earth while plowing? And we see from this that the Mishnah is saying that somebody who covers the seeds of Kilayim with earth is as one who is sowing with Kilayim. In other words, we're trying to figure out, again, like with what we do with plowing in Sheviis, well, what do we do with plowing with regards to Kilayim? Because isn't that really just sowing? That's really the question. So, the Ritva is going to be saying, as a parallel to this in Makot 21b, it's going to be saying that the act of plowing in and itself does not transgress the prohibition of Kilayim. After all, before the sowing, which is when plowing takes place, there's no Kilayim for seeds for which they become liable. In other words, you didn't put anything in the ground yet. So where we're looking back now in Devarim 22:9, where it says, you shall not sow your vineyard Kilayim, this is implying that only sowing is forbidden, not plowing. So we see over here that, wait a second, this is really brilliant because, plowing is not mentioned over here in the laws of Sheviis. And also, plowing is not mentioned over here with Kilayim. What do we do with plowing? And if you were doing plowing and you had, put the seeds in and now you used a plow to cover it up, didn't you really just sow? That's not really plowing. Maybe that's just sowing. So what is the malacha of plowing and Kilayim? And by the way, brilliantly, it's putting it together with over in Sheviis and plowing with Sheviis, because what did you do when you plowed in Sheviis? So Rabbi Yanai was, really amazed by what Rabbi Yochanan is saying with, this understanding about Masechet Makot and the connection between this. And he's saying like this. He says, Rabbi Yanai was praising Rabbi Yochanan for his proof by citing various scriptural verses. And he said, those who pour gold from the purse. Now, I want to point out this is a verse that comes from Isaiah 46:6. And this verse is actually talking about people who worship idols, that they're squandering gold in making idols. But Rabbi Yanai turns it. And he's saying that Rabbi Yochanan, according to the Pnei Moshe about this, is actually, possessing a lot of Torah wisdom and gold in abundance. And the Rosh Hashanah has a beautiful explanation of Rabbi Yanai's verse, use of this verse, saying that Rabbi Yanai praised Rabbi Yochanan by contrasting him with those who squandered their lives fruitfully amassing gold. And the Rosh Hashanah's deep insight is that Rabbi Yochanan's life was spent in fruitful acquisition of Torah learning. Really brilliant insight by Rosh Cirilio. Now, I want to point out and put a little marker on this because Rabbi Yanai, his teacher, I believe it's in 4 or 6 places in the Yerushalmi Shas, has this statement come up. I know one is going to be over in Sota. He has many times where there's also going to be one time in the beginning of Trumos in 1:1. So in over here, when he's giving praise to his brilliant insights to his student, this use of the phrase comes up many times. And I believe it also comes up twice in the Bavli Shas. So anyway, it says, those who pour gold from his purse, and my son, let them, words of Torah, not be removed from your eyes. He's giving his student a really beautiful blessing by now coming and taking part of Proverbs 3:21, and is talking over there now about the great value of Torah. And Rabbi Yanai is urging Rabbi Yochanan to always sit and study Torah. And the Pnei Moshe says that he's always going to be getting these new insights because he's always connected with Torah learning. In other words, not a casual thing for him. He's not like a dilettante. He's really immersed in it. That's really a lesson for us. And now he's pulling from another verse in Proverbs, and it says over from 9:9, and it says, give the wise man, and he will become yet wiser. And Rabbi Yanai gives in another verse from also from Proverbs, and he's saying the wise man shall hear and increase his learning. And really, these are stitching together 4 verses from the Tanakh to praise his student about sticking to Torah learning and being serious about it and being really active in it. And that's something that we can be inspired from and we can learn about, and we can try to connect to that as well. In other words, we all have to try to be more like a masmid, where we're sitting and learning and delving into the depths of Torah learning. And we don't do Torah learning like a dilettante where we come once in a while and sort of learn a little bit. We really delve into each one of the laws, and with regards to earning parnasah, well, Hashem will take care of you just as he did for Rabbi Yochanan. Now, Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish comes back and questions Rabbi Yochanan on this. In other words, his insight being that, wait a second, what exactly did you do when you plowed for Kilayim? What exactly did you do when you plowed for Sheviis? And so Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish is saying back to Rabbi Yochanan and saying, in spite of all of these praises, I can interpret the Mishnah in accordance with the ruling of Rabbi Akiva, in which case it would not stand as proof for Rabbi Yanai's ruling. So Rabbi Akiva says in a brisa, one who maintains Kilayim transgresses a negative commandment. In other words, if the Mishnah is going to be following Rabbi Akiva's view, we're saying one who covers those seeds through an act of plowing is going to be liable to lashes, not because he was considered to have sown the Kilayim, but because he maintained the Kilayim, and that is going to be biblically forbidden according to Rabbi Akiva. So this Mishnah that we have in Kilayim 8:1, well, maybe that's going to be saying that the act of plowing is an act of maintenance according to Rabbi Akiva and not an act of sowing. So the Gemara actually is going to reject Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish's argument. And it says, did not Rabbi Akiva say that only with regard to transgressing? And did he perhaps also say with regards to lashes? Certainly not. And here, however, the Mishnah in Makot is saying that we are dealing with lashes. So it would seem, says the Pnei Moshe, that this Mishnah is not following Rabbi Akiva's view. And, the reasoning behind the Mishnah's ruling is that, plowing among seeds, and when you're doing that, what did you do by the act of plowing? Well, were you maintaining? No, you were sowing. And that's Rabbi Yochanan's proof for the Mishnah. In other words, when he's saying, what happened in Makot? What happened? Well, what did you do when you plowed? Did you maintain? Well, Rabbi Akiva would say if you're maintaining, that is going to be biblically forbidden. You get lashes for it. And Rabbi Yochanan is saying, well, that's not actually what happened when you were plowing. When you were plowing, you were covering the seeds. What did you do when you covered it with earth? Well, it's going to be like what we see in this Mishnah over here in 8:1. You were sowing, and that's going to be the brilliancy of it. So the Gemara is actually going to be presenting another proof that the Mishnah in Makot is not prescribing lashes for maintaining Kilayim. That, by the way, is Rabbi Akiva's point. But why are we saying over in Makot that you get lashes? Well, that's going to be because when you covered the earth on top of the seeds, that was an act of sowing. So again, plowing has this sort of like weird thing of what do you do with it over in Sheviis? What do you do with it over here? And the Gemara says, furthermore, this is seen from that which we learned in the Mishnah, which lists the following transgressions as one of the 8. What's that going to be? Well, Sheviis. And what happens when you go ahead and you plow even a single furrow on Sheviis? So, what did you do? Do you get Makot? Well, over in Makot, you're saying that's one of the 8 things. You do get Makot for it. So but that's interesting, right? Because again, we just saw in Vayikra, well, that's not listed in there. So the Gemara says, and can you possibly say that the Mishnah's ruling regarding Sheviis is in accordance with Rabbi Akiva? Of course not. In other words, Rabbi Akiva does not prohibit maintaining a Sheviis planting. And the reasoning behind the prohibition with plowing, in other words, one that covers a seed with earth, is going to be looking like an act of sowing. So, in other words, the same would also apply with regards to plowing Kilayim seeds. So, the thing is that the Gemara is trying to prove that even Rabbi Akiva, who does say that there's lashes for maintaining Kilayim, that the Mishnah is still going to provide proof that that plowing over seeds is considered an act of sowing. By the way, that is not going to be the view of Rabbi Akiva, and it's not the view of Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish. They're, by the way, saying that the act of plowing is an act of maintenance. So what do we do here where the Mishnah is saying that somebody who plows on Sheviis is subject to lashes? So why would you be getting lashes for making a furrow on Sheviis? Well, that doesn't look like an act of maintenance on Sheviis. Rabbi Akiva doesn't prohibit an act of maintenance on Sheviis. He does for plowing. And again, he's going to be deriving the prohibition of plowing biblically, but he's doing it differently than Rabbi Yishmael. And the case is going to be a little bit different where, if you were plowing in Sheviis, that the case would be in the Mishnah where the seeds are lying on the ground and then you're plowing them and covering them with earth. That's going to be an act of sowing on Sheviis, and that's going to be punished by lashes. So that's how you get it where Rabbi Akiva would agree over in Makot that you're getting the lashes. Why? Because the seeds are on top. And what did you do? You plowed to get them into the ground. So this is going to be the step in the plowing that Rabbi Akiva would agree. Now, the case that we have over here in this Mishnah is that you have the seeds and you covered them with earth. And the question is, was that an act of maintenance in terms of Kilayim? So the Gemara is going to look again at this act of plowing during Sheviis. And, again, what did you do when you were plowing? And is it going to carry a penalty of lashes? So the Gemara says that we can interpret the ruling regarding Sheviis in accordance with the view of Rabbi Lazar. And Rabbi Lazar says that we incur lashes for plowing in the Sheviis year. So again, this is now going to be the mloket among the Amorim. Again, we know that there's a mloket about plowing in Sheviis among the Tanaim and how that's proved. Now, Rabbi Lazar has a disagreement with Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Lazar is going to be saying like this, that since the act of plowing, this is according to Marafulda, on Sheviis is itself punishable with lashes, and we see that over there in Makot, that the Mishnah's lashes for Sheviis is going to be occurred for the plowing itself, and not because the plow caused the seeds to be covered with earth. So when we see, again, that's really really the question, right? The question is, did we cover the seeds with earth? And can we say that that happened as an act of plowing, or was that just an act of sowing? Now, the Gemara is going to look at why Rabbi Yochanan does consider the proof for Sheviis to be valid. In other words, why are we connecting over here Sheviis and over here Kilayim, which, by the way, I think is secretly brilliant. Rabbi Yochanan says like this, that we do not incur lashes for plowing in the Sheviis year. And according to Rabbi Yochanan, the act of plowing itself is not subject to lashes, that the lashes are incurred because the plowing covered seeds with earth. In other words, that's the issue. And again, this is not explicitly said in the Torah in Sheviis. Plowing is not in there. There's other ones. And Rabbi Yochanan is saying that plowing is unique because sometimes plowing is going to be for improving the earth. Sometimes it's going to be for trying to get water into the ground. And sometimes it's going to be where you actually covered seeds. So plowing can be doing many things. It's not going to be the same as reaping. Reaping is just one thing, right? But plowing can be many things. And so the ruling of Sheviis is showing that plowing among seeds is going to be tantamount to sowing. In other words, when you plowed, what did you do, right? And that's even what Rabbi Akiva is trying to look at. Did you maintain? Did you prepare the earth and really you just didn't do anything? If there were seeds there and you covered them, Rabbi Akiva says you maintained. And it looks like Rabbi Lazar is saying that you maintained as well. But over here, Rabbi Yochanan is saying, no, it's an act of sowing. Now, the Gemara is going to conclude the Gemara's discussion regarding the prohibition to cover Kilayim seeds with earth, because that's, again, what we care about. When you covered the seeds with earth, what did you do? And did you maintain, or did you actually sow? And again, now we're going to get into Rabbi Yochanan's explanation about plowing in the Sheviis year, and it begins by looking at Rabbi Lazar's point. In other words, now we're getting into what happened when you did this on the Sheviis year. Because again, Makot comes and connects these. It connects Kilayim, where you made a furrow for Kilayim, and also in the Sheviis year. And it says, this is Rabbi Lazar's reason, it says that the land shall observe a Shabbos rest unto Hashem. And that, by the way, is going to be a generalization. In other words, all agricultural work in the seventh year is going to be forbidden. And this, by the way, is going to be very similar to what Rabbi Akiva is looking at. And by the way, that verse is coming up in Vayikra 25:2. And it says, and it continues, and it says, your field you shall not sow, your vineyard you shall not prune. And he says that this is a specification because it singles out two particular forms of labor for prohibition. Now, it continues and it says, the acts of sowing and pruning were included in a general prohibition. And when were they singled out for a specific mention in the verse? It says to compare other labors of the field to these two. In other words, it's creating a hekesh, and it's using one of the 13 principles of hermeneutical interpretations that we have, right? It has a specific, something that's very specific to something that's general. That's one of them. And also we have here that we have, specific to learn other kinds of forbidden acts. In other words, it's saying like, okay, we can't do this, but how is Chazal proving this, right? And the Gemara continues, and it says to compare other kinds of labors to these two and tell us that just as sowing and pruning are unique in that they're labors performed for the sake of a land or a tree and are also going to be punished with lashes, so too anything that is a labor performed for the sake of a land or tree is punished with lashes. So he's using a hekesh. That's going to be that there's one example that can be extrapolated out to lots of other examples. What's a case of that? Well, shulchas aveda, when the Torah says, if your friend or neighbor lost a donkey, you have to return it. And Chazal is explaining that it's a hekesh. It's a classic case for a hekesh. You can see that over in Baba Metzia, chapter 2, halacha 3. What is that doing? Well, that's coming and saying that, hey, if somebody lost a car, they lost tickets, they lost a wallet, they lost a backpack, you have to go return it, just like you have to go return the donkey. In other words, that Rabbi Lazar is coming along and saying that, where it's saying that you shall not sow your vineyard, you shall not prune, these are dealing with trees, and these kind of agricultural acts for something like a vineyard, which we know is a kind of tree, right? that also you can extrapolate that to other kinds of labor like plowing for other cases with regards to Sheviis as well as with Kilayim. But Rabbi Yochanan doesn't agree with that. And the Gemara says, what does Rabbi Yochanan do with this verse? By the way, this, is going to be the same verse that we're seeing over here for what we just read in the beginning of the Shir in Vayikra 25, which is for Sheviis. And what does he do with this? And the Gemara explains, it says, they, sowing and pruning, are two prohibitions that were singled out from the general category of Sheviis prohibitions. And so the Gemara continues and says, when two prohibitions are singled out from a general category as being separate with regard to punishment, they do not serve to separate other members of the category into distinct prohibitions with regard to punishment. Again, he's using a different hermeneutical principle from one of these 13 that we have as a core that every sage agrees with on what are these 13 for understanding oral law and how to read the Torah. And so when the verse specifies a single member of a given category where the law can be extended to other members of a group, but it doesn't specify the verse with two members of a general category. So in the case of Sheviis, since both sowing and pruning are specified, then the law is not extended to other Sheviis prohibitions. In other words, now when we see the donkey, we see one case. We don't see two added in there. And that's what Rabbi Yochanan is saying. He's saying that, no, two are mentioned here, not one. So contrary to Rabbi Lazar's assertion, the verse is not proof that plowing on Sheviis is punishable with lashes. So the idea is that the Gemara is referring to one of these principles. And how do we understand? Well, if you have a general category that's singled out in the Torah as regarding a specific law, that's going to be a model. It's going to be called a hekesh for the entire category. And generally, this is going to be a single act that's mentioned. But that's not what happens here. What happens here is that there are two acts that are mentioned in here. We have the two acts are going to be in here. It's going to be sowing and pruning. And just like returning the lost donkey, well, that's going to be a single example that's extrapolated out. Over here, he's using two. So Rabbi Yochanan is saying that actually that's going to be not the hekesh that's being used, but that's going to be when two prohibitions are singled out from a general category, that they're going to be separate with regards to punishment. And in other words, it's not going to be like a hekesh, it's going to be those two. So there's a lot of other examples that come up, like in Shabbos, with other similar kinds of examples. But the Gemara is stating here that the principle applies only where the Torah is singling out one member of a given category and not two members of a given category. And so this Gemara is reasoning that when it's singled out one member of a category, it would be enough to serve as a model for the entire category. But by unnecessarily singling out yet another member of another category of work, the Torah is implying that these two prohibitions are unique and that their law is only dealing with them. That's Rabbi Yochanan's point. Now, we're going to get more into hermeneutical principles in the third part of this year in chapter 8, Halacha 1, because there's a lot of back and forth here between Rabbi Lazar and Rabbi Yochanan on how do we deal with a singled out category or when you have two. And again, there are 13 principles of, and we say this every day in Chakras, there's 13 principles on how to interpret. And this is going to be agreed by everybody. And so when we have a case here, and again, what we do with Sheviis is kind of odd. And also it's kind of odd, what do we do with Kilayim when we plowed? Plowing is this sort of weird sort of act. And that's why it's not mentioned specifically in that text in Vayikra 25. And it, what do you do with it, right? Because plowing can be doing for where you've covered seeds. Well, did you sow it? Did you maintain it? If you were plowing, did you try to get water into the ground to try to make your yield better for fruit trees? That's something that chapter 1 of Sheviis talks about. What about plowing to prepare the earth for the future? What about plowing after the second rain to try to break up hard ground after it was sitting in the sun over a summer? Well, plowing can be doing lots of different things. It also could be just covering seeds with earth. So when you covered the seeds with earth in plowing, what did you do? Did you maintain Kilayim, or did you actually just sow Kilayim? And the brilliancy is that this Gemara puts this act of plowing together with Sheviis, because these two things are a source of maloket and hard to understand and worth looking at together. Have a great day.